Welcome back to HOA Nuisance Files. Let us get into it. I am standing on my driveway in Phoenix, Arizona, when Helen Harris storms across the street with a measuring tape clipped to her belt and a phone aimed at my mailbox. She is the HOA president of Copper Canyon HOA, and she is already yelling before she reaches the curb. "You are in violation of community standards," she says. "And if you do not fix this immediately, you are looking at a compliance hearing and a $500 fine." My mailbox numbers are non-compliant, she tells me, because the style does not match the approved vendor list. I work in operations, and my job depends on a predictable routine, so the last thing I need is surprise drama on a Tuesday morning. I moved to this master-planned community in Phoenix because I wanted to stop renting and build equity. But I am learning that Copper Canyon HOA is the kind of place where tiny violations get big fines. Helen is in her mid-50s, short gray hair, neon pink windbreaker, and she has that measuring tape clipped to her belt like a badge of authority. I am wearing a light gray hoodie, jeans, and I am already regretting every decision that led me here. She taps the mailbox with one finger and says the numbers are the wrong font and the wrong size. I ask what she means, and she pulls out a laminated sheet from her clipboard. It is a style guide with 3 approved number fonts, and mine is not on the list. I tell her I bought the numbers at the hardware store and they match the ones on my neighbor's mailbox, but she cuts me off. "Your neighbor has been here longer," she says, "so he was grandfathered in. You should have read the rules before you moved in." That line lands like a slap, and I can already feel the frustration building. I ask when this rule went into effect, and she says it has been in the bylaws since 2022. I moved in 3 months ago, in January of this year, and nobody mentioned mailbox fonts during the walkthrough. Helen does not care. She snaps a photo of the numbers with her phone and says I have 14 days to replace them or face a formal hearing. I go inside and pull up the HOA portal on my laptop. The rules section is a mess, 47 pages of PDFs with conflicting version dates, and I cannot find anything about mailbox number fonts. I call the property manager, a guy named Eric who has been quietly helpful since I moved in. He picks up on the second ring and sighs when I explain what happened. He tells me Helen has been doing surprise inspections all week and hitting people with violations for things that are not even in the current bylaws. Eric says the board is aware, but they are afraid to push back because Helen has been HOA president for 6 years, and she knows every loophole. He warns me not to ignore the notice because Helen will escalate fast. I ask if he can send me the actual rule, and he says he will dig through the archives and get back to me. I thank him and hang up, but my stomach is already tight. My next paycheck is already spoken for. Rent, car payment, student loans, and a $500 fine would wreck my budget. That night, I go back outside to look at the mailbox. The numbers are brushed aluminum, about 4 inches tall, mounted on a black post. They look fine to me. I take photos from every angle and send them to Eric with a timestamp. He replies an hour later with a scan of an old email chain between the management office and the board. The email is from 2023, and it shows the board discussing emergency responder visibility rules. One line stands out. The city fire marshal recommends numbers be at least 3 inches tall and in a reflective finish, but the font is not specified. I screenshot that line and save it. I do not know if it will help, but I have a feeling I am going to need every piece of evidence I can find. The next morning, I walk out to grab my coffee, and there is a bright orange notice taped to my mailbox. It is a formal violation letter on Copper Canyon HOA letterhead, printed in bold, and it repeats the same complaint, non-compliant mailbox numbers. The letter says I have until March 15th to remedy the issue or I will be scheduled for a compliance hearing. Today is March 1st, so I have 2 weeks. I peel the notice off and fold it into my pocket. A neighbor 2 houses down, an older guy named Frank, is getting his mail and he waves. I walk over and ask if he has ever gotten a violation notice. He laughs and says Helen hit him last year for parking his truck in the driveway overnight. He paid the fine because fighting it was not worth the hassle. I ask if he knows anyone who has fought back and won. He shakes his head and says most people just move out. That is not an option for me. I just bought this place, and I am not letting Helen run me off over mailbox fonts. I call Eric again and tell him about the notice. He says he found the original rule in the 2022 bylaws, and it does list 3 approved fonts, but it also says existing installations are allowed as long as they meet fire code. I ask if my numbers meet fire code, and he says yes. They are reflective and over 3 inches. He adds that Helen has been interpreting the rules her own way, and the board has not corrected her because she files everything with the HOA attorney and makes it expensive to fight. I ask if he can put that in writing, and he hesitates. He says he can send me an email summary, but he cannot testify at a hearing because his company has a contract with the HOA, and he does not want to lose it. I understand, but I also realize I am mostly on my own here. Eric does send the email that afternoon, and I save it in a folder labeled evidence. Over the next week, I start documenting everything. I take photos of every mailbox on my street, and I count at least 8 different number styles. Some are vinyl stickers, some are painted, some are the same aluminum style I have. I make a spreadsheet with addresses, number styles, and installation dates based on public records. I also check the City of Phoenix website and find the actual fire code for address visibility. It says numbers must be at least 3 inches tall, contrast with the background, and be visible from the street. My numbers check every box. I print the city code and add it to my folder. On March 7th, Helen shows up again. I am pulling into my driveway after work when she steps out of her car and waves me down. She has the measuring tape on her belt and a new clipboard. She says she is doing a follow-up inspection to confirm I have not made any changes. I tell her I am still researching the rule, and she cuts me off. I am just doing my job, she says, and the rule is the rule. I ask her to show me the section in the bylaws, and she flips through her clipboard and points to a paragraph about architectural compliance. It is vague, just a sentence about maintaining community standards, and it does not mention mailbox fonts at all. I point that out, and she says the approved vendor list is an addendum. I ask to see the addendum, and she says it is on file with the management office. I tell her Eric could not find it, and her face tightens. She says if I continue to delay, she will move the hearing up. I say I am not delaying, I am following the process, and she walks away without another word. That night, I get an email from the HOA attorney. It is CC'd to the board, and it says my violation hearing has been scheduled for March 14th at 7 in the evening, 1 day before the deadline. The email says the hearing will be conducted via Zoom, and I am allowed to present evidence and call 1 witness. I forward the email to Eric and ask if he will be my witness. He replies an hour later and says he cannot, but he will send me everything he has found in the management files. He also says the board member who handles compliance, a guy named Roger, has been asking questions about Helen's enforcement methods. That is the first good news I have had in 2 weeks. The next morning, Eric sends me a zip file with email threads, rule revision logs, and a scan of the original 2022 bylaws. I open the bylaws and find the mailbox section. It lists 3 approved fonts: Arial, Helvetica, and Times New Roman. My numbers are not labeled with a font name because they are pre-made hardware store letters, but they look closest to Arial. I take another photo of my numbers and compare them side by side with an Arial sample. They match close enough that I feel confident arguing it. I also find an email in Eric's archive from 2023 where Helen asks the board to add enforcement language for mailbox inspections. The board replied and said they would discuss it, but there is no follow-up. That means the enforcement she is doing now is not officially authorized. I add that email to my evidence folder. On March 12th, 2 days before the hearing, I get a call from Roger, the compliance board member. He introduces himself and says he has been reviewing my case file. He asks if I have submitted any evidence yet, and I say I am preparing it. He tells me to send everything to the HOA attorney by 5 in the evening tomorrow so the board has time to review it. He also says, off the record, that Helen has been targeting newer homeowners because they do not know the rules well enough to fight back. He says the board has received complaints, but Helen claims she is just doing her job and nobody wants to start a fight. I ask if he thinks I have a case, and he says if I can prove my numbers meet fire code and match one of the approved fonts, the board will likely rule in my favor. He adds that Helen has a personal grudge against people who question her authority, so I should be ready for her to push back hard. I thank him and start organizing my evidence. I spend the next day putting together a presentation. I create a slide deck with photos of my mailbox, screenshots of the city fire code, the email thread from management, and side-by-side comparisons of my numbers with the Arial font sample. I also include the email where Helen asked for enforcement language that was never approved. I send the entire package to the HOA attorney at 4:30 in the afternoon and CC the board. The attorney replies with a receipt confirmation and says the board will review it before the hearing. The hearing is set for 7 in the evening on March 14th. I log into the Zoom link at 6:55 and wait in the lobby. At 7 sharp, the attorney admits me into the meeting. The board is already there, Helen, Roger, and 2 other members I have never met. Helen is wearing the same neon pink windbreaker and she has her clipboard in front of her. The attorney introduces himself and explains the process. Helen will present her case first, then I will present mine, then the board will vote. He asks if I have any questions, and I say no. Helen starts by reading the violation notice out loud. She says I installed non-compliant mailbox numbers in violation of community standards and I have refused to correct the issue. She shows a photo of my mailbox on screen and circles the numbers with a digital pen. She says the numbers are not on the approved vendor list and they do not match the required font. I wait for her to finish, and then the attorney asks if I want to respond. I share my screen and pull up my slide deck. I start with the city fire code and explain that my numbers are over 3 inches tall, reflective and visible from the street. I show the side-by-side comparison with Arial and point out that the shapes match. Then I show the email thread where Eric confirmed that existing installations are allowed as long as they meet fire code. I also show the email where Helen requested enforcement language that the board never approved. I finish by showing photos of 8 other mailboxes on my street with different number styles, and I ask why I am the only one being cited. Helen interrupts and says those other homeowners were grandfathered in, but I pull up the property records and show that 3 of them moved in after I did. The board goes quiet. Roger speaks up and asks Helen if she has documentation showing that my numbers are not Arial. She flips through her clipboard and says the vendor list specifies that numbers must be purchased from approved suppliers. I point out that the bylaws say nothing about suppliers, only fonts, and my numbers match Arial. The attorney asks Helen if she has a copy of the approved vendor list, and she says it is on file with management. Roger says he asked Eric for it last week, and Eric could not find it. Helen says Eric is confused and the list exists. I share my screen again and show the email where Eric searched the archives and confirmed there is no current vendor list on file. The board votes to table the violation pending a full review of the enforcement language. Helen argues, but the attorney cuts her off and says the board has made its decision. The meeting ends, and I log off feeling like I just won round 1. If this story is making you want to hear how it ends, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter. 2 days later, I get an email from Roger. He says the board reviewed all the evidence, and they agree that my numbers meet fire code and match aerial closely enough to be compliant. He also says the board has asked Helen to provide the approved vendor list by the end of the week or admit it does not exist. He adds that several other homeowners have come forward with similar complaints about Helen's enforcement methods, and the board is looking into creating clearer standards. I reply and thank him, and I feel a small wave of relief. I am not out of the woods yet, but I have momentum. That relief lasts exactly one day. On March 17th, I get a new email from Helen. It is CC'd to the board and the attorney, and it says she is scheduling a special meeting to discuss emergency responder access compliance. The email claims that my mailbox post is blocking the sight line for fire trucks and it needs to be relocated. I read it twice and realize she is escalating to a completely different rule. I forward it to Eric and ask if this is real. He calls me 10 minutes later and says Helen is grasping at straws. He says the fire department did a neighborhood inspection in 2024 and there were no sightline violations on my street. He offers to pull the inspection report and send it to me. I tell him yes, and I add it to my evidence folder. The special meeting is set for March 21st at 6:30 in the evening, again on Zoom. I spend the next 3 days gathering everything I can find about fire department access rules. I pull the city code, the fire marshal's recommendations, and the inspection report Eric sent me. The report is from November 2024, and it lists every street in Copper Canyon. My street is marked green with no violations. I also find a city email from January 2025 where the fire department responded to a resident complaint about mailbox placement. The email says mailbox posts are not considered obstructions as long as they are within the standard setback from the curb. I measure my post and confirm it is 2 feet from the curb, well within the setback. I add the email and the measurement to my slide deck. The night before the meeting, Roger calls me again. He says Helen has been telling the other board members that I am being difficult and wasting everyone's time. He also says one of the board members, a woman named Linda, is starting to side with Helen because she does not want to deal with the conflict. Roger warns me that I need to be direct and factual at the meeting, and I should avoid any personal attacks. He says if I stay calm and stick to the evidence, I will win. But if I get emotional, Helen will use it against me. I thank him and spend the rest of the night rehearsing my presentation. The meeting starts at 6:30. Helen opens by showing a diagram of my street and highlighting my mailbox post in red. She says the post is creating a blind spot for fire trucks turning onto the street, and she has received complaints from neighbors. I ask who complained, and she says the complaints were verbal and confidential. The attorney asks if she has any written documentation, and she says no. I share my screen and show the fire department inspection report from November. I point out that my street is marked green with no violations, and I show the city email that confirms mailbox posts are not obstructions. I also show photos of the sightline from both directions, and the post is not blocking anything. Helen interrupts and says the inspection was done before I moved in, so it does not apply. I pull up my property records and show that I closed on the house in December 2024, after the inspection, and the post has not moved since the previous owner installed it in 2021. The board goes quiet again. Linda, the board member who was siding with Helen, speaks up and asks why Helen is pursuing this if the fire department already cleared the street. Helen says she is just doing her job and following up on resident concerns. Roger asks her to provide the names of the residents who complained, and she refuses. The attorney says that without documentation or witness statements, the board cannot proceed with a violation. Helen argues that the bylaws give her discretion to enforce safety standards, but the attorney points out that discretion does not override city code. The board votes to dismiss the sightline complaint, and Helen logs off the call without saying goodbye. I thank the board and log off, and I finally feel like I am winning. The next morning, I get an email from Eric. He says the board held a closed session after the meeting, and they decided to issue a formal reprimand to Helen for pursuing violations without proper documentation. He also says the board is going to hire an independent compliance inspector to review all active violations and make sure they are legitimate. Eric adds that several homeowners have filed complaints against Helen, and the board is considering removing her from the compliance committee. I reply and ask if I am in the clear, and he says yes, my case is closed. He also says the board is going to issue me a written apology for the harassment. I sit back and let that sink in. It is over. 2 days later, I get a letter in the mail from the Copper Canyon HOA board. It is a one-page apology on official letterhead, signed by all 4 board members, and it says the board reviewed my case and determined that I was in full compliance with all applicable rules. The letter also says the board is implementing new training for enforcement procedures to prevent future misunderstandings. I fold the letter and put it in my evidence folder, just in case I ever need it again. That weekend, I run into Roger at the neighborhood grocery store. He is picking up coffee, and he waves me over. He says Helen resigned from the board 3 days ago, effective immediately. She sent an email to the attorney saying she was stepping down due to personal reasons. But Roger says everyone knows it is because she lost control of the compliance process. He also says the board is planning to revise the bylaws over the next 6 months and create clearer standards for violations and appeals. I thank him for his help, and he says I did the hard part by standing up and documenting everything. He adds that a lot of homeowners are grateful because they were too afraid to fight back. I tell him I am just glad it is over, and he laughs and says welcome to HOA life. A few days later, I get a text from Eric. He says the board hired a new property manager to replace him because his company lost the contract. He is not upset, he says, because he was planning to leave anyway. He adds that the new manager is going to do a full audit of all HOA records and clean up the enforcement files. I thank him for everything he did to help me, and he says he is just glad someone finally stood up to Helen. He also sends me a final email with a subject line that says Trump card. I open it and find a forwarded message from the City of Phoenix Code Enforcement Office. The email is dated March 10th, 2025, and it is a response to a complaint Helen filed about my mailbox. The city inspector reviewed the complaint and replied that my mailbox is in full compliance with city code and no action is required. The inspector also noted that the HOA does not have the authority to override city regulations. I save the email and smile. I never had to use it, but I was ready. On March 30th, I walk out to my mailbox to grab the mail and I see Frank, my neighbor, washing his truck in the driveway. He calls over and asks how the HOA thing turned out. I tell him I won and the board apologized. He laughs and says he wishes he had fought his violation instead of paying the fine. I tell him the board is revising the rules and setting up a better appeals process, so maybe he can get his money back. He says he will look into it. We talk for a few minutes about the neighborhood, and he mentions that a few other homeowners are planning to challenge old violations now that Helen is gone. I tell him I am happy to share my evidence folder if anyone needs it, and he says he will spread the word. It feels good to know that standing up made a difference for more than just me. That night, I sit on my front porch with a beer and look at the mailbox. The numbers are still the same brushed aluminum letters I installed 3 months ago. And they look fine. I think about everything that happened, the notices, the hearings, the emails, the stress. And I realize I learned something important. HOAs only have as much power as you let them have. If you document everything, follow the process, and refuse to back down, you can win. It is exhausting and it takes time, but it is worth it. I finish my beer and go inside, and for the first time in weeks I sleep without worrying about what violation notice is going to show up next. A month later, in late April, I get an email from the new property manager introducing herself and asking if I have any outstanding concerns. I reply and say everything is resolved, and I thank her for reaching out. She says the board is hosting a town hall in May to present the revised bylaws and answer questions, and she hopes I will attend. I tell her I will be there. The town hall happens on a Saturday morning, and about 30 homeowners show up. The board presents the new rules, which include clear definitions for violations, a mandatory review process before any fines are issued, and a requirement that all enforcement actions be documented and approved by the full board. Roger explains that the changes are designed to prevent the kind of overreach that happened with my case, and he thanks me publicly for bringing the issues to light. A few people clap, and I feel a little embarrassed but also proud. After the meeting, 3 homeowners come up to me and ask for copies of my evidence folder. I send it to them that afternoon. By the end of May, the neighborhood feels different. There are no more surprise inspections, no more orange violation notices taped to mailboxes, and no more Helen walking around with her measuring tape. The new compliance process is slower, but it is fair, and people are not afraid to push back anymore. I run into Linda, the board member who initially sided with Helen, at the community pool one afternoon. She apologizes for not supporting me sooner, and says she did not realize how much Helen was overstepping until she saw all the evidence I presented. I tell her I appreciate the apology, and we talk for a few minutes about the new bylaws. She says the board is committed to making Copper Canyon a place where people want to live, not a place where they feel harassed. I tell her that is all I wanted from the beginning. In early June, I get a final email from Eric. He says he found a new job with a different management company, and he is doing well. He also says he heard from a friend that Helen tried to join the board of another HOA in Scottsdale, but they turned her down after checking her references. I laugh and reply that karma works fast. Eric says he is glad I stood my ground and he hopes the new rules stick. I tell him I will make sure they do. On a warm evening in mid-June, I am sitting on my porch again, and I see a young couple moving into the house 3 doors down. They are unloading boxes from a truck, and they look excited and a little stressed. I walk over and introduce myself. They tell me they just bought the place and they are nervous about the HOA because they have heard horror stories. I tell them the board just revised the rules and things are a lot better now. I also tell them to document everything, read the bylaws, and never be afraid to ask questions. The husband laughs and says he already printed the bylaws and highlighted the important sections. I tell him he is going to do just fine. We talk for a few more minutes and then I walk back to my house. I look at my mailbox one more time and I smile. The numbers are still non-compliant according to Helen's old interpretation. But according to the city, the board, and common sense, they are exactly what they should be. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.